Look at your hands. Look at your lifelines. Look at your eye color. You are the end of a chain of events that has been unbroken for 1 billion years. A chain of millions of dates. Your ancestors survived ice ages and plagues, and all for one thing: to pass on their code. Today, we'll look into the shadows, about what was sacred, sinful, illegal, and completely natural. This is the full story of how we learned to desire. For the first 1 billion years, life was boring. Bacteria simply copied themselves. I am you, you are me. No individuality. An evolutionary dead end. But 1.2 billion years ago, a tiny alga revolutionized life. It fused its code with another organism. This was the first act in the planet's history. Why? To survive. Sex has become the main weapon against the parasites. We traded the immortality of clones for diversity and death. A pricey deal, huh? But the real game began in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago. There, intimacy wasn't a personal secret. It was a sacred communal duty. Every woman was required to come to the temple once in her life and give herself to a stranger for a coin. This was sacred prostitution, a form of prayer. In ancient Greece, the concept changed. There, sex became an art and a status symbol. But there was a detail that shocks us today. A partner's gender mattered less than their social standing. The primary issue was dominance. Who led the relationship and who obeyed? It was pure power. By the 4th century, ancient freedom had evaporated. Rome had fallen, and on its ruins, a new harsh morality arose that turned everything upside down. What had once been a gift from the gods and art was officially declared original sin and the work of the devil. The world was plunged into the darkness of total suppression. The church took control of the most personal matters. Intimacy was now permitted only for the sake of procreation, under the strict supervision of canon law. Detailed lists of forbidden days appeared when intimacy was considered a sin. The human brain became a field of endless battle with one's own instincts. But human nature can't simply be switched off. The stronger the taboos, the more sophisticated the secret life became. The Middle Ages became an era of great double standards. But if you thought the Middle Ages were the height of weirdness, welcome to the 19th century. An era where shame was elevated to absolute status and made into a state ideology. The Victorian era. A time when even furniture legs were covered with slipcovers to prevent them from evoking indecent associations. Fear of the body reached absurd extremes. Doctors of the time warned any activity outside of reproduction would lead to blindness, insanity, or paralysis. Society buttoned up its sleeves, but inside, everything was seething. It was then that the first global black market in history was born. While prayers were being recited in living rooms, millions of copies of something people were afraid to even contemplate were being printed underground. The Victorians practically invented modern peeping culture. The more layers of clothing and restrictions there were, the higher the price of a single, accidental glance. At the beginning of the 20th century, the wall of silence cracked. A man named Sigmund Freud accomplished the impossible. He began to speak about it out loud, as if it were a science. He declared that our hidden desires are neither sin nor madness, but the main driving force of the human psyche. Everything we've suppressed for centuries hasn't disappeared. Freud brought intimacy out of confessionals and basements and into doctors' offices. He demonstrated that behind our fears and dreams lies a powerful energy, libido. Following him came those who decided to measure it physically. For the first time in history, sex ceased to be merely a myth or a sin. It became the object of rigorous laboratory study. The secret was no longer a secret. The world stood on the brink of the most resounding revolution humanity had ever seen. The old rules no longer applied, but the resistance was fierce. In the 1930s, Hollywood introduced the Hays Code, a strict set of rules: how many seconds a kiss could last and how beds should be positioned. Cinema was supposed to be sterile, but this only forced directors to become geniuses in illusion. A single glance or a lit cigarette became more significant than an entire scene. It was a cat-and-mouse game with censorship. Society was still trying to maintain decorum, while the reality of life on the streets and in the trenches of the world wars dictated its own terms. War upended everything. When death looms, the old moral dogmas of the Victorians crumble to dust. People wanted to live in the here and now. A new era was dawning, a time when science and pop culture would unite to finally shatter this centuries-long silence. The countdown to the 1960s had begun. In 1948, a quiet zoologist named Alfred Kinsey rocked America. He released a report on male behavior based on thousands of anonymous interviews. The numbers were shocking. What had been considered a rare aberration turned out to be the norm for most. Kinsey showed the world its true face, tearing off the mask of propriety. But a real tectonic shift occurred in 1960. The first birth control pill appeared, a tiny disc that forever separated pleasure from childbirth. It was the quietest, yet most powerful, revolution in history. For the first time, women gained complete control over their bodies and their futures. The old world was crumbling. The springs snapped. The 60s were beginning, an era when sex emerged from the shadows onto the streets, into music, and into newspaper headlines. It was no longer possible to contain it. The Summer of Love of 1967. The slogan, "Make love, not war," became the anthem of a generation tired of the fear and hypocrisy of their fathers. Victorian morality was consumed by the fires of rock and roll. Sexuality became a form of protest. People no longer wanted to hide their desires. It seemed the world was finally free from the shackles of shame. But the 70s brought a new problem. The disco era commodified intimacy. It became superficial, fleeting, and impersonal, like a flash of neon. In the 1980s, with the advent of home video recorders, intimacy returned to homes, but in a completely different form. An industry was born that would soon take over the internet. But while the world celebrated its victory over hypocrisy, a new, deadly threat was brewing in the shadows. The euphoria of freedom was coming to an end. In the early 1980s, the euphoria came to an abrupt end. A new shadow appeared on the scene, a virus that turned freedom into a death sentence. AIDS changed the rules of the game. Intimacy has once again become a fear zone. Those who yesterday called for a summer of love were today forced to talk about safety, barriers, and death. Governments around the world launched scare campaigns. Conservatism returned under the guise of health concerns. The turn of the 1980s and 1990s became a time of great retrogression. But while the world was battling a biological virus, a new network was emerging, one that would forever change the very mechanics of human connection. The digital age was upon us. Sexuality began to move into the virtual realm. First chats, then forums, then huge databases. We learned to desire through pixels on a screen. Welcome to the 21st century, the era of Tinder and instant choice. We've turned finding a partner into a trip to the supermarket, where split seconds decide everything. Algorithms know more about your preferences than you do. Global data analyzes your every click, shaping your desires for you. We now stand on the threshold of virtual intimacy. VR neural networks, and artificial intelligence promise us an ideal experience without risk or human complications. But the paradox is that with such increased access to content, people are becoming increasingly lonely. We've replaced the deep ocean of emotion with the endless shallows of numbers. The history of intimacy is the history of the struggle between biology and culture. Over the course of 1 billion years, we've evolved from red algae to neural networks. Where do we go next? Technology may change form, but its essence will remain the same. We are still the same creatures, seeking warmth in the cold of space. The main thing is not to lose humanity in the flood of algorithms.